Let's move on to the hypertrophy section, and we're going to do RVH. I saved this for level 2 because RVH is a lot less common than LVH. So there are 3 criteria: R greater than S in lead V1, R greater than 7 millimeters in V1, and then the R prime of an RSR prime in V1. This is greater than 10 millimeters. And this would also apply to a QR. So this is in patients generally with a right bundle or an incomplete right bundle pattern. This would be a QR, and you'd be talking about this for this criterion here. But the RSR prime would be something like this, RSR prime. So since there's an R, that makes this guy an R prime. And the same thing would apply if it was like this, or if it was like this. You'd be talking about this part of the complex. So we'll call it an R prime. R prime greater than 10 millimeters is the third criterion. And then there are ST and T wave changes expected with RVH, and those are ST depression and T wave inversion in leads V1 to V3. Let's do some examples. First one, you're looking at V1. We see R greater than S, R greater than S. So we've got R greater than S in lead V1. Let's do another example. V1, we've got a tall R wave. So we've got an R wave that's greater than 7 millimeters. That's a criterion for RVH. And also, this one has R greater than S in V1. So by both of the criteria, we've got RVH. Here's a third example. We've got a QR, and this is greater than 10 millimeters. So that's the criterion for RVH. And it says R prime here, so for this to be an R prime, there'd have to be a little R wave there. It would have to look like that. So in this case, it's really just an R greater than 10 millimeters with a right bundle or QR complex. So that's a criterion for RVH. And then this one also shows the secondary changes to RVH with the ST depression and T wave inversion in leads V1, V2, and V3. There you go, RVH. Moving on to the bundle branch block portion of level 2. So the first item in that is going to be left anterior fascicular block. Left anterior fascicular block. So over here, after conduction passes through the AV node and then the His bundle here, the blue part, it hits the bundles, and the His bundle divides into the right bundle and the left bundle, and then the left bundle divides into the anterior fascicle and the posterior fascicle. So left anterior fascicular block is when conduction gets blocked here, and it doesn't go down that pathway. It just goes this way and then down the right bundle. The criteria for this are as follows. You've got left axis deviation from minus 45 to minus 90. So looking over here, minus 30 is right here. To be left anterior fascicular block, which is arbitrarily defined as being from minus 45 to minus 90. So you're in this range. Then you're looking at a QRS of 0.08 to 0.10 seconds. So 2 little boxes to 2.5 little boxes. You're looking for the morphology of a small R wave and an S wave in lead 2. And then, importantly, you can't have either of these. So there are no criteria for LVH and no criteria for inferior infarct on the ECG. If you meet all these criteria, then you have left anterior fascicular block. This diagnosis used to bother me a lot as a student and as a resident. I didn't really see how it affected what we did with the patients, and that's played out in my career as an attending, that it's not too frequent that you make this diagnosis and then you learn something new about the patient. But anyway, it does indicate that there is some pathology of the conduction system over here, although it's not a very specific diagnosis. let's look at an example. So we're looking at the ECG here. As we do the axis, we see lead 1 is positive and AVF is negative. So that means for lead 1, we're on this side of the circle. For AVF, we're going on this. We're on the upper side of the circle, and the intersection of those is here. So looking back up here, we know we're in the quadrant where we could have left axis deviation. Then we got to look at lead 2 and see if that's positive or negative. And lead 2 here, it's about 3 positive, so 3 minus 6, something like that. So lead 2 is negative, and that means we're in the left axis deviation realm. Whether it's minus 45 or not sure, but close enough. So we'll be thinking about left anterior fascicular block here. Is the QRS duration, what is it? Looks like it's about 2 little boxes. So that fits here, 0.08 seconds. There's clearly an RS in lead 2, little r, s. And then we don't see any criteria for LVH. So AVL here, it is not greater than 11. And we're not seeing big S waves here or big R waves. So there's no LVH. And then there's no Q waves here in 3 and F. These are little R waves. So there's no inferior infarct. And since all these criteria are met here, we're going to call it left anterior fascicular block. The trickiest part is knowing if you're minus 45 to minus 90. I mean, you can tell if you're anywhere around here, but it's hard to tell the difference between minus 40 and minus 45. So generally, I will use the computer's reading on the axis number to decide if it's more than minus 45 and therefore meeting criteria for left anterior fascicular block. Let's move on to left posterior fascicular block, which is a lot less common than left anterior fascicular block. So the definition for that is there's right axis deviation between 100 and 180 degrees. So over here, 100 to 180. The QRS is 0.08 to 0.10. There's an RS in lead 1 and a QR or just R wave in lead 3. Let's look at the schematic here. So conduction goes through the AV node, the His bundle, and gets blocked when it tries to go through the posterior fascicle. But it goes through the anterior fascicle and the right bundle. Let's do our example here. So we're doing the axis, which is usually when this comes up. When you're thinking about the axis, 1 is negative, so we're over here. And then F is positive, so we're here. The intersection of those two is this quadrant here. So we're in the right axis deviation quadrant, and then 1 is actually quite negative. It's basically 3 little boxes minus 7, so it's minus 4, so it's really quite negative. And the more negative lead 1 is, because lead 1 is here, the more negative it is, the more this way it is. So if lead 1 were isoelectric, that would tell you were here, and you wouldn't be in the range of 100 to 180. But because lead 1 is negative, you know that you're kind of in this direction more. So the axis on this ECG is probably something like 120 or 130. And that's in the range for left posterior fascicular block. So we've got the right axis deviation, we've got this. Then the QRS duration is about 2 little boxes. And then there's an RS, a little R and a big S wave in lead 1. And then the QR in lead 3. There's a little bitty Q wave and then an R. So it meets the criteria for left posterior fascicular block, and it doesn't come up very much, frankly. There you go, left posterior fascicular block.